The Roman Empire, vast and enduring, stretched across continents, from the rolling green hills of Britain to the golden sands of Egypt. Its boundaries touched the icy rivers of Germania and the sun-drenched coasts of North Africa, a realm of immense diversity, culture, and life. At its heart, Rome stood as a city of extraordinary grandeur. Marble columns rose like silent witnesses to history, their surfaces etched with the marks of centuries of human endeavor. The Forum, the heart of civic life, echoed with the footsteps of senators and citizens alike, and the marketplace buzzed with activity. Merchants called out their wares, from fragrant spices to colorful textiles, the aromas of freshly baked bread mingling with the scents of incense and oils carried from distant provinces. Children played near fountains, and street performers, musicians, and storytellers added rhythm and color to daily life. Yet beneath this apparent vitality, the foundations of the empire were beginning to shift in quiet but meaningful ways. Rome had reached a point of immense territorial expansion, and with it came the challenges of maintaining cohesion across vast distances. Roads that had once symbolized connection and order now carried messengers who struggled to keep communication timely and accurate. The distant provinces, each with their unique cultures and languages, were sometimes difficult to govern, their loyalty to the central authority increasingly tenuous. In the eastern provinces, traders in cities like Antioch and Alexandria observed Rome's influence while quietly pursuing their own interests. In the western territories, along the Rhine and Danube, military outposts faced constant vigilance, their soldiers alert to the shifting patterns of migration and raids from tribes beyond the frontier. The empire's borders, which had once seemed secure, were slowly becoming areas of stress, pressure, and uncertainty. Economically, the empire faced challenges that would gradually erode the stability of daily life. For centuries, the Roman economy had relied on conquest, trade, and the steady flow of tribute from subject peoples. The gold and silver coins of the treasury had allowed for grand infrastructure projects, public spectacles, and the maintenance of armies. But as expansion slowed, the wealth that had long flowed freely began to wane. Emperors seeking to meet the demands of governance and defense resorted to minting coins with progressively less precious metal, unintentionally fueling inflation. Markets continued to operate, but the cost of grain, clothing, and essentials steadily increased. Farmers and laborers struggled to meet tax obligations, while the wealthy elite accumulated greater fortunes, their villas rising in grandeur amidst the growing strain of the lower classes. In the bustling city streets, one could see the contrast between lavish banquets and the humble meals of ordinary citizens, a quiet reflection of economic imbalance shaping the fabric of Roman society. Politically, the empire was no longer the stable structure it had once been. The imperial throne, once a symbol of continuity and law, had become precarious. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, often the result of intrigue, betrayal, or military force, rather than consensus or merit. Senators, who had once wielded significant influence, now struggled to exert any real power over decisions that shaped the empire's destiny. Citizens watched the succession of rulers with a mixture of hope and apprehension, aware that the security of their daily lives often depended on forces beyond their control. The instability at the top created ripples that extended through every corner of Roman life. Governors, military commanders, and regional administrators often acted independently, seeking to maintain their own authority as the central power faltered. The empire, immense as it was, seemed to wobble quietly, a giant still standing but already showing the first signs of imbalance. Amid these economic and political strains, the cultural life of Rome remained vibrant, even as it evolved. Temples and shrines continued to mark the spiritual landscape, their ceremonies blending traditional pagan rituals with emerging forms of devotion. Festivals, games, and public entertainment offered citizens a measure of distraction and enjoyment, while scholars, poets, and artists worked quietly to preserve and reinterpret knowledge. The Latin language remained a unifying thread, connecting people across disparate regions, yet local dialects and customs increasingly colored the daily lives of those on the fringes of the empire. Even as the familiar rhythms of life continued, subtle changes in religion, culture, and social expectations were reshaping the identity of the empire in ways that would only be fully understood in retrospect. On the frontiers, the Roman military faced pressures that tested its traditional strength and discipline. Soldiers stationed along the Rhine and Danube found themselves not only defending the borders, but also managing the complex relationships with neighboring tribes. Germanic tribes, some long acquainted with Roman customs, others strangers to the imperial way, pressed against the boundaries with varying intentions. Some sought trade and settlement, others challenged Roman authority with raids and skirmishes. The army, though still formidable, increasingly relied on foreign recruits and mercenaries whose loyalty was often transactional. The once unified legions were beginning to reflect the complexities and compromises of a sprawling empire under strain. Even within Rome itself, the lives of ordinary citizens subtly reflected these pressures. Urban neighborhoods experienced growing disparities, with the poor facing crowded living conditions and limited access to resources. Public granaries and grain distributions were essential for survival, and dependence on these systems highlighted vulnerabilities in a society once thought stable and self-sufficient. Elite citizens maintained their influence through patronage and wealth, yet even their grand villas and gardens could not shield them entirely from the turbulence outside their walls. Daily life continued, a mixture of continuity and adaptation, carrying the weight of the empire's long history even as new challenges quietly shaped its trajectory. Nature itself seemed to mirror the empire's slow drift. Plagues occasionally swept through cities and countryside alike, reducing populations and stressing resources. Crop failures and famines struck with irregularity, sometimes caused by drought, other times by flooding, reminding citizens that the empire's power was not absolute over the forces of the natural world. Trade routes, though vast and intricate, could be disrupted by storms or banditry, highlighting the delicate balance that Rome had long maintained between human ambition and the uncertainties of geography and climate. The Roman Empire at this time existed in a state of subtle tension. It was still magnificent, still alive with the energy of human endeavor, yet it was slowly transforming under the weight of its own size, ambition, and history. The structures of governance, the rhythms of daily life, the security of borders, and the stability of the economy all faced pressures that, while not immediately catastrophic, pointed toward a gradual erosion of the empire's cohesion. It was a twilight period, not marked by dramatic collapse, but by the gentle fading of strength, the quiet transformation of institutions, and the slow, almost imperceptible shift of human societies toward new realities. To witness Rome at this moment was to see an empire both resilient and vulnerable, majestic yet fragile. The city of marble, the bustling forums, the distant provinces, and the vigilant legions all contributed to a living tapestry of civilization at its peak, and yet quietly approaching a period of change. The empire's decline would not be a sudden event, but a centuries-long process, a drift toward final days that would unfold with the inevitability of time itself. And within this slow transformation, the stories of ordinary citizens, soldiers, merchants, and scholars continued, their lives interwoven with the larger currents of history, carrying forward the legacy of a civilization whose influence would endure long after its political power waned. In this gentle twilight, the Roman Empire remained an extraordinary entity, a reflection of human ambition, ingenuity, and resilience. It stood poised between the enduring memory of past triumphs and the subtle pressures that would shape the centuries to come. Listeners may imagine the soft light falling on the Tiber River, the quiet movement of people in the forums, and the distant hum of activity in villas and markets. It was a time of both splendor and quiet uncertainty, a period in which the empire slowly, almost imperceptibly, drifted toward the final days of its Western legacy. The Roman Empire, immense in size and influence, depended on a complex network of trade, tribute, and agriculture to sustain its wealth. For centuries, conquest had been a primary source of prosperity, bringing new lands, goods, and labor into the imperial system. Gold, silver, and other precious resources flowed from distant provinces to Rome, filling the treasury and enabling ambitious construction projects, magnificent public spaces, and the maintenance of an extensive military. Roads stretched like arteries across the empire, connecting provinces to the capital, facilitating trade, communication, and governance. Markets in every city thrived with the exchange of goods from near and far. Grain from Egypt, olive oil from Hispania, spices from Arabia, and textiles from Gaul filled bustling forums, while merchants and traders ensured that Rome itself was a place of abundance. Yet over time, this once stable economy began to show strain. As the pace of conquest slowed, the steady influx of tribute and plunder diminished. The treasury, which had long depended on external sources of wealth, faced mounting challenges. To meet the demands of governance, defense, and public works, emperors resorted to minting coins with progressively less silver, sometimes introducing large quantities of bronze and other base metals. The resulting inflation gradually eroded the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. Prices rose slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, but the effect was cumulative. Markets, though still busy with the activity of merchants and shoppers, carried a quiet tension beneath the surface. Families who had once relied on their income to sustain a modest yet comfortable life now found themselves struggling to meet the costs of food, clothing, and household necessities. The economic imbalance within the empire became increasingly pronounced. Elite citizens, often owners of vast estates or influential businesses, retained and even expanded their wealth. They built villas with shaded gardens, mosaics, and private baths, living lives of considerable luxury, while the majority of citizens labored to survive in crowded neighborhoods or on small farms. Patronage systems grew in importance, as wealthy elites maintained influence by supporting public events, festivals, and charitable distributions of food. For the ordinary citizen, reliance on these systems became a quiet necessity. Public grain distributions, a tradition known as the annona, offered relief and sustenance, yet they also reflected a fragile dependence on imperial administration and wealth redistribution. In rural areas, farmers faced similar pressures. Land that had once yielded abundant crops was increasingly difficult to cultivate. Soil exhaustion, unpredictable rainfall, and localized conflicts with neighboring communities all contributed to diminishing yields. Taxes levied by the state or local officials often demanded the equivalent of a substantial portion of production, leaving farmers with barely enough to feed their families. Rural communities, traditionally self-sufficient and resilient, were slowly becoming vulnerable to the broader economic pressures of the empire. Seasonal cycles dictated life, yet even these rhythms were subject to the subtle disruptions of political demands and resource scarcity. Trade networks, the lifeblood of Roman economic vitality, also experienced strain. Long-distance trade required not only stability along roads and rivers, but also reliable governance in every region. Pirates along the Mediterranean or bandits along inland routes occasionally disrupted supply chains, reducing access to luxury goods and essentials alike. While urban markets continued to bustle, the cost of imported commodities quietly rose. The empire's dependence on far-flung territories meant that disruptions in one province often created ripple effects across the entire system. In addition, military campaigns, while still necessary for defense, became increasingly expensive, diverting resources from civil projects and public investment. The balance between sustaining infrastructure, funding armies, and maintaining social cohesion became delicate, with small shifts producing cumulative consequences. Citizens themselves felt these pressures in subtle ways. In Rome, marketplaces remained crowded, but the cost of everyday items slowly grew, and the disparity between wealthy and poor became more visible. The aroma of fresh bread or roasted meats reminded citizens of sustenance, yet many families depended on state distributions to avoid hunger. In towns across Gaul, Hispania, and the Italian countryside, the rhythm of life continued, but households quietly adjusted to rising prices, modifying diets, and making small sacrifices to meet basic needs. Even in prosperous areas, the underlying tension between abundance and scarcity shaped social interaction, work, and the choices that families made in daily life. Inflation had broader implications beyond immediate subsistence. It affected public confidence in the empire and its institutions. When coins were increasingly debased, citizens could sense the weakening value of money, which in turn reflected on the perceived competence of leadership. Markets, previously a symbol of stability and prosperity, carried whispers of uncertainty. Merchants, traders, and even local officials understood that the empire's wealth was not limitless and that fiscal mismanagement could have cascading effects. The combination of rising costs, diminishing resources, and elite accumulation of wealth quietly eroded social cohesion, creating subtle fractures in the fabric of society that had once seemed unshakable. Alongside these economic strains, employment patterns were shifting. Urban centers required laborers for construction, trade, and service, yet fewer young men were available for work due to military service, migration, or early death from disease or hardship. Rural laborers faced similar shortages, prompting the increased use of tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and in some regions, slaves to maintain production. These adjustments sustained the economy in the short term, but also reflected growing inequalities in wealth, opportunity, and social mobility. The empire remained productive and sophisticated, yet the signs of strain were evident in the lives of those who labored quietly to sustain it. Public works, a hallmark of Roman civilization, continued, yet even these reflected economic pressures. Aqueducts still carried fresh water to cities, roads still connected distant provinces, and public baths offered relief and leisure. Temples continued to rise, adorned with intricate sculptures and colorful frescoes. Yet the construction, maintenance, and funding of these projects increasingly depended on taxing an already burdened population. The grandeur remained visible, but the effort required to sustain it underscored the growing gap between appearance and underlying capacity. The empire's splendor was preserved, even as the foundations supporting it were quietly eroding. Economic strain also intersected with military obligations. The need to fund legions along distant borders required substantial resources, and recruiting soldiers increasingly depended on offering generous pay, land, or privileges. As coins lost value, the costs of paying armies rose, placing additional pressure on provincial economies. Soldiers, in turn, became more conscious of their material needs and compensation, and loyalty sometimes became a matter of survival rather than patriotic devotion. The empire's capacity to defend itself, maintain infrastructure, and support daily life relied on careful balance, a balance that was increasingly difficult to sustain. In times of scarcity, social tensions naturally rose. Urban and rural communities alike experienced disparities in access to food, shelter, and opportunity. Wealthy elites enjoyed the trappings of power, while ordinary citizens relied on the slow rhythms of labor, trade, and state provision. Festivals, entertainment, and religious ceremonies offered solace, yet they could not erase the quiet awareness that resources were finite, and the empire's stability increasingly depended on careful management. Life continued, and the empire endured, yet the pressures of economy and inflation created subtle tremors beneath the visible calm of society. The story of Rome's economy in this period is not one of immediate collapse, but of gradual change, a quiet transformation that touched every corner of the empire. From the bustling streets of Rome to the farthest provinces, citizens adapted to rising costs, shifting labor, and subtle disruptions in trade. Markets continued to hum with activity, roads remained lifelines of commerce, and communities found ways to sustain themselves. Yet the pressures of inflation, economic imbalance, and reliance on finite resources quietly shaped the course of history, setting the stage for the slow drift of the empire toward its eventual decline. In reflecting on this period, one can imagine the marketplaces filled with the scent of spices, bread, and oil, the chatter of merchants and customers, and the constant movement of goods across the empire. Rome, still a center of magnificence, bore the hidden marks of strain. The silver in the coins was less bright than before, prices for essential goods quietly rising. Farmers, traders, soldiers, and citizens carried the weight of an empire that, though outwardly strong, faced subtle and persistent challenges that would echo for centuries. The economy, both vibrant and vulnerable, was a mirror of the empire itself, grand, complex, and slowly beginning to feel the weight of its own immensity. The Roman Empire, immense and complex, relied not only on wealth and armies but on the steady guidance of leadership. For centuries, Emperors had provided continuity, legitimacy, and vision, bridging the vast distances between provinces and the capital. Yet by the 3rd century, this sense of stability had begun to erode. The imperial throne, once a symbol of law, tradition, and authority, had become increasingly precarious. Leaders rose and fell with alarming frequency, often due to intrigue, betrayal, or the influence of the military rather than popular support or legal succession. Rome's citizens, accustomed to the continuity of imperial rule, began to sense the fragility beneath the surface of apparent order. The Senate, once the beating heart of Roman governance, had grown less influential. Senators who had exercised real political authority now found themselves relegated to ceremonial roles, their voices often ignored or overridden by the will of ambitious generals or the whims of emperors. Rome's political system, which had once balanced tradition with innovation, became a theater of maneuvering, where ambition, loyalty, and fear intersected. Assassinations, forced abdications, and rapid successions of rulers became a recurring pattern. Citizens watched from their homes, temples, and marketplaces, aware that the stability they had long taken for granted was slipping quietly into uncertainty. Emperors themselves faced immense pressures. They were expected to maintain the loyalty of the legions, to secure the borders against increasingly aggressive tribes, to oversee vast bureaucracies, and to ensure the flow of resources to sustain the cities and provinces. Failure to meet these demands could be fatal. Some emperors responded with wisdom, skill, and patience, navigating the treacherous currents of Roman politics with finesse. Others fell victim to their own decisions, to plots within the palace, or to rebellion among the military ranks. Over time, the succession of rulers, sometimes chosen for lineage, sometimes for force, often for convenience, produced a sense of instability that seeped into every aspect of governance. In the provinces, governors and local officials operated with increasing autonomy. With communication slow and uncertain, and with the empire's borders under constant threat, local leaders often took matters into their own hands, enforcing laws, collecting taxes, and organizing defenses as they saw fit. The distant authority of the emperor, though symbolically present, often carried less weight than the practical control exercised by these regional powers. Soldiers, citizens, and merchants in these areas adapted to local leadership, while still acknowledging the symbolic importance of Rome. The empire, vast and multifaceted, was slowly shifting from a centralized authority to a collection of interconnected regions, each influenced by local circumstances and pressures. Military involvement in politics grew more pronounced during this era. Generals who commanded the loyalty of their troops often held the real power, capable of elevating or deposing emperors at will. Legionary allegiance became a decisive factor in succession, overshadowing traditional legal or hereditary claims. The very institutions that had sustained Rome for centuries were being reshaped by the practical realities of survival and power. While soldiers remained dedicated to their duty, their influence on the political system reflected a subtle transformation. Loyalty was often conditional, tied to pay, privileges, or promises, rather than enduring allegiance to a distant throne. This environment produced frequent crises of leadership. Some emperors, rising from the ranks of the military or the bureaucracy, were highly competent and capable of stabilizing their realms. Others were weak, indecisive, or consumed by vanity, leaving the administration vulnerable to manipulation by advisors, generals, or opportunistic officials. During such periods, the empire often experienced short-lived reforms or bursts of effective governance, only to be followed by periods of confusion and instability. These cycles became increasingly frequent, leaving citizens and provincial officials alike uncertain about the continuity of imperial policy or the reliability of leadership. Public perception of leadership was shaped not only by the behavior of emperors, but by the consequences of their policies. Taxation, resource allocation, and defense all depended on competent administration. When governance faltered, it was not merely the elites who felt the consequences. Ordinary citizens, farmers, merchants, and soldiers experienced the effects directly. Markets could falter, grain distributions could be delayed, and local security could weaken. Over time, the perception that the empire's institutions were faltering eroded trust and contributed to a quiet but pervasive sense of vulnerability. Rome, magnificent as it appeared, was increasingly seen as a city and an empire whose internal cohesion was fragile. Civic life, however, continued in remarkable ways, even as political turmoil persisted. Citizens attended temples, participated in festivals, and engaged in commerce, adapting to changes in leadership while maintaining their own rhythms of daily life. Public entertainment, including games, theater, and spectacles in amphitheaters, offered relief from political anxiety, while the intellectual and cultural life of the empire continued to thrive. Scholars, poets, philosophers, and artisans pursued their crafts with diligence, sustaining a sense of continuity even as political instability challenged the structure of governance. In this sense, the Roman people themselves became agents of resilience, maintaining a vibrant civic culture amidst uncertainty. The rapid turnover of emperors also had profound effects on succession and legitimacy. Dynasties rose and fell, and the symbolic importance of imperial lineage became intertwined with the practical realities of military support and political alliances. The very idea of what it meant to be emperor shifted from one of inherent right to one of contingent power, dependent on circumstance and personal loyalty. For ordinary citizens, this meant that the seat of ultimate authority was often a distant abstraction, its influence mediated through local leaders, military commanders, and administrators whose decisions were more immediate and tangible. Political intrigue was woven into the fabric of the empire in ways both subtle and dramatic. Assassination plots, rivalries among generals, and competition among provincial governors created an atmosphere of quiet tension. Decisions at the highest levels had cascading effects, influencing not only governance but trade, resource allocation, and the morale of armies and citizens alike. The empire's machinery continued to function, yet it relied increasingly on ad hoc measures, improvisation, and the skill of individuals rather than the steady reliability of institutional structures. Amid these challenges, the symbolic power of the emperor remained significant. Public ceremonies, military parades, and religious rituals reinforced the presence of authority, projecting stability even when the underlying structures were strained. Coins bore the emperor's visage, public inscriptions proclaimed achievements, and monumental architecture celebrated power. These symbols were vital, offering reassurance to citizens and provincial populations alike. Yet beneath the symbols, the cracks of instability could be discerned by those who observed carefully. The brief reigns, the military interventions, and the shifting alliances that shaped everyday life across the empire. The political turbulence of this period also influenced the broader social fabric. Citizens adapted by placing more reliance on local leaders, patrons, and networks of family and community. Urban and rural populations alike navigated daily life with awareness of the uncertainties at the top. While official decrees emanated from Rome or Constantinople, the practical administration of justice, security, and commerce was increasingly mediated through regional authorities. This gradual decentralization reflected both the resilience and the vulnerability of the empire, as local initiative compensated for weaknesses in central governance, but also signaled the limits of imperial reach. Throughout this era, the Roman Empire remained remarkably resilient, capable of weathering crises and adapting to challenges. Yet the repeated episodes of leadership instability, combined with economic pressures, military reliance on conditional loyalty, and social adjustments, created a cumulative effect that quietly weakened the empire's cohesion. The structures that had once seemed permanent and unshakable, the Senate, the imperial office, the legions, were now tested in ways that required constant adaptation. Each cycle of turmoil left subtle marks on the fabric of governance, shaping the political landscape and setting the stage for the continued drift toward decline. One can imagine the streets of Rome in this period, alive with the rhythms of daily life, yet carrying an undercurrent of uncertainty. Markets were busy, temples echoed with prayers, and children played near fountains, all while the machinery of government shifted quietly in the background. Soldiers returned from distant frontiers, carrying news and maintaining vigilance, their presence a reminder of both the empire's power and its fragility. Emperors came and went, some remembered with reverence, others forgotten within months, their legacies tied more to circumstance than enduring rule. Political turmoil in the empire was not sudden or cataclysmic, it was subtle, gradual, and persistent. Like a river slowly eroding its banks, it reshaped the landscape of governance, leaving both visible and invisible traces. Citizens, armies, and provinces adjusted to these shifts, learning to navigate uncertainty while sustaining daily life. Rome, magnificent in architecture, culture, and influence, remained a center of civilization, yet the signs of strain were unmistakable to those who observed closely. The empire's drift toward instability was now evident, setting the stage for challenges that would deepen in the centuries to come. In this period, the Roman Empire stood as both a testament to human ingenuity and a reminder of the delicate balance required to govern a vast realm. Its grandeur persisted in monuments, markets, and institutions, while its political foundations quietly shifted beneath the surface. The interplay of ambition, loyalty, and circumstance shaped the course of leadership, influencing the lives of citizens across the empire. It was a time of subtle transformation, where the patterns of governance, power, and authority were in flux, quietly guiding the empire toward the complexities and challenges of its later centuries. The Roman Empire, by the 3rd and 4th centuries, had grown to a size that was almost unimaginable. Its reach extended from the foggy hills of Britain in the northwest to the deserts of North Africa, from the sunlit shores of Hispania to the fertile lands of the Nile. The empire's borders stretched across rivers, mountains, forests, and plains, each region presenting its own challenges and opportunities. While the interior of the empire, the bustling cities, the fertile farmlands, and the vibrant trade centers remained under Roman control, the frontiers were a different story. Along these edges, life was marked by vigilance, preparation, and the constant anticipation of potential threats. In the northern regions, along the Rhine and Danube rivers, Roman legions were stationed to monitor and repel incursions from the Germanic tribes. The forests of Germania and the marshes of northern Europe provided both a natural barrier and a haven for groups who resisted imperial control. Small forts, watchtowers, and fortified settlements dotted the landscape, manned by soldiers who understood that their vigilance was essential to the survival of provinces far from Rome itself. These troops were often far from their families, living in austere conditions, yet their duty demanded constant readiness. They patrolled riverbanks, trained rigorously, and maintained the walls that marked the limits of Roman authority. The pressure along these borders was not always constant in intensity, but persisted as a quiet, ongoing challenge. Tribes beyond the frontiers sometimes conducted raids for food, livestock, or resources. Other times, they sought negotiation, trade, or settlement within Roman lands. The empire's leaders, both in Rome and in provincial centers, had to balance diplomacy, military strategy, and resource allocation with careful precision. Any miscalculation could lead to destabilization, as frontier regions were vulnerable to swift changes in fortune. A sudden incursion by a large group could spark fear, disrupt trade, and require mobilization of troops that might otherwise be stationed elsewhere. In the east, along the borders with the Parthians and later the Sasanian Persians, the Roman Empire faced a different kind of pressure. The deserts and mountains of these regions presented natural obstacles, yet the Persian forces were formidable, skilled in both siegecraft and cavalry maneuvers. Roman commanders had to navigate both geography and diplomacy, maintaining garrisons, negotiating truces, and occasionally engaging in campaigns that required significant resources. These eastern provinces, rich in trade and culture, were vital to the empire's economy, yet they remained on the edge of potential conflict. The legions stationed there were acutely aware that the empire's strength depended on their constant vigilance, readiness, and strategic foresight. Along the southern frontiers, in North Africa, the empire faced not only the challenges of desert landscapes, but also the threat of pirate activity along the Mediterranean coast. Roman cities like Carthage had long been centers of trade and administration, yet maintaining security required careful planning and allocation of military and civic resources. The desert regions, sparsely populated and difficult to traverse, provided both refuge and challenge, demanding local knowledge and adaptation. Trade routes connecting the interior to the coast had to be protected, and local communities often depended on both the military and civic authorities to ensure their safety and prosperity. Life along the frontiers was characterized by an awareness of both immediacy and uncertainty. Towns and villages maintained watchtowers, trained local militias, and constructed fortifications as a precaution against sudden incursions. Farmers and merchants, while living in relative peace during much of the year, were ever mindful of the potential for conflict. Trade caravans moving along roads and rivers were accompanied by guards, not only to protect goods, but to signal Rome's authority and presence in often remote and contested regions. Communities adapted to the rhythms of military patrols, seasonal campaigns, and the quiet diplomacy that underpinned the empire's relationships with neighboring peoples. The pressure at the borders also influenced social and political life within the provinces. Governors and military commanders often wielded considerable autonomy, given the need for rapid decision-making in response to threats. These leaders balanced the demands of local populations with directives from Rome, navigating a delicate tension between central authority and practical necessity. Soldiers stationed at the edges of the empire became both protectors and intermediaries, enforcing Roman law while also managing relations with neighboring tribes. Loyalty, discipline, and strategic insight were essential for the maintenance of stability. Economic considerations were closely tied to border management. Taxes, tribute, and trade provided the resources necessary to maintain fortifications, pay soldiers, and sustain local economies. Any disruption along the frontier could have immediate and far-reaching consequences, affecting supply lines, market prices, and the livelihoods of both civilians and military personnel. Towns that lay near borders were often bustling with activity, markets supplying soldiers and local populations alike, yet they carried a quiet tension born of proximity to potential conflict. The borderlands were both lifelines and points of vulnerability, reflecting the empire's reliance on vigilance, adaptability, and constant strategic awareness. The presence of the legions at the edges of the empire also had cultural implications. Soldiers stationed far from Rome brought with them Roman customs, language, and religious practices, which gradually influenced local populations. In some regions, communities adopted aspects of Roman law, architecture, and daily life, creating a complex tapestry of cultural exchange. At the same time, the interaction with neighboring peoples introduced new customs, technologies, and ideas into the empire, enriching Roman culture while also reminding citizens that their civilization was part of a larger, dynamic world. The challenges along the borders were not limited to human adversaries. Geography, climate, and disease also tested the empire's resilience. Harsh winters in the north could isolate fortifications, floods along the Danube disrupted communication and supply lines, and outbreaks of disease occasionally decimated both soldiers and civilians. The empire's leaders had to account for these natural pressures, integrating local knowledge, medical practices, and strategic planning into their defense systems. Even in regions far from Rome, the delicate balance of resources, manpower, and environmental factors demanded careful attention and adaptation. Diplomacy played a central role in managing frontier pressures. Treaties, tributes, and negotiated settlements allowed Rome to maintain relative stability in regions that could not be continuously patrolled. Alliances with friendly tribes or neighboring states provided buffers against potential invasions, and the careful exchange of gifts, promises, and concessions often proved as important as military action. These interactions required skillful negotiation, patience, and an understanding of local dynamics, reinforcing the idea that the empire's strength depended not only on armies and fortifications, but also on nuanced engagement with the world beyond its borders. Despite the constant vigilance required, life in the border provinces carried a sense of quiet rhythm. Farmers tilled the land according to seasonal cycles, merchants conducted trade along rivers and roads, and families carried out daily routines with care and attention. Soldiers trained, patrolled, and maintained fortifications, creating a structured environment amidst potential uncertainty. Festivals, religious observances, and communal events continued, offering moments of connection and stability. In this way, the borderlands were not only sites of military preparedness, but also communities with rich social, cultural, and economic life, reflecting the resilience of the empire even under pressure. Over time, the cumulative stress of managing distant frontiers became a defining feature of the Roman Empire. Maintaining effective control over vast territories required immense resources, strategic foresight, and continual adaptation. While Rome itself remained the symbolic heart of the empire, the edges bore much of the practical burden of survival and stability. These pressures shaped military strategy, political decisions, and social structures, creating a complex web of interdependent systems that reflected both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the empire. The pressure of the borders also foreshadowed the challenges that would grow more acute in later centuries. The northern tribes, increasingly organized and motivated, would press further into Roman territory. In the east, Persian forces continued to test military skill and strategic planning. In Africa and along the Mediterranean coast, economic and environmental factors demanded vigilance and adaptation. The empire's capacity to absorb these pressures while sustaining daily life, commerce, and governance was remarkable, yet the strain was a quiet, persistent force shaping the trajectory of history. Imagining the frontiers of the Roman Empire is to see a landscape of contrasts. Dense forests and misty rivers in the north, vast plains and mountains in the east, deserts and sun-baked roads in the south. Along these edges, forts, watchtowers, and settlements stood as silent sentinels, manned by soldiers whose duty required constant awareness and readiness. The rhythm of life was dictated by seasons, patrols, trade cycles, and the occasional threat of conflict, creating a delicate balance between vigilance and everyday living. Even amidst potential danger, communities endured, adapted, and continued the traditions of Roman civilization. The pressure at the borders was a quiet, ongoing reminder of the empire's vastness and the delicate balance required to maintain control. Rome's power was immense, but it was not absolute. Distance, geography, human ambition, and environmental forces all contributed to the complex challenges of governance. The empire's edges, far from being distant abstractions, were living, breathing landscapes where the realities of imperial authority, military necessity, and social life converged. These pressures, persistent and multifaceted, gradually shaped the trajectory of the empire, foreshadowing the transformations and struggles that would define its final centuries. Within the vast expanse of the Roman Empire, the daily life of ordinary citizens unfolded in ways both familiar and extraordinary. Cities were centers of commerce, culture, and social interaction, while rural communities maintained the rhythms of agriculture, livestock, and village life. Yet beneath the apparent continuity and order, social divisions were becoming more pronounced. Wealthy elites maintained grand villas, adorned with mosaics, marble columns, and private baths, while ordinary citizens often lived in crowded insulae, apartment buildings rising several stories high, packed with families whose lives were shaped by the limitations of space and resources. The contrast between luxury and modesty was striking, yet the empire's cultural cohesion remained strong, tied together by shared language, law, and customs. Urban life in Rome, Carthage, Antioch, and other major cities was a blend of vibrancy and quiet tension. Markets overflowed with goods from across the empire, spices, textiles, metals, pottery, but prices reflected underlying economic strain. The cost of essential items such as grain, olive oil, and wine slowly rose over time, creating subtle stress for families who depended on state distributions or personal savings to meet daily needs. Street vendors called out their wares, bakers, ovens filled the air with comforting aromas, and children played near fountains or along narrow streets, yet the disparities in wealth were increasingly visible. The spectacle of grandeur, paralleled by the struggle of ordinary life, created an atmosphere where citizens navigated daily existence with care, patience, and quiet resilience. In the countryside, life was equally defined by both continuity and challenge. Farmers tilled fields, tended animals, and participated in seasonal cycles that had guided agriculture for centuries. Yet rising taxes, soil exhaustion, and unpredictable weather created difficulties for those who depended on the land for sustenance. Smallholders often leased land from wealthy landlords or shared harvests under agreements that limited their independence. Rural communities relied on local leadership, family networks, and communal practices to maintain social cohesion, while distant governors and imperial authorities demanded taxes and tribute. The balance between self-sufficiency and external obligation shaped daily life, reminding citizens that survival required adaptation and resilience. Slavery remained a fundamental aspect of Roman society, influencing both the economy and social structure. Slaves were found in households, workshops, farms, and public works, performing labor that ranged from menial tasks to skilled craftsmanship. Their lives were tightly controlled, yet some could earn freedom or influence through service. The presence of slavery highlighted the stark inequalities of Roman society, and the reliance on human labor created both economic efficiency and moral complexity. For free citizens, the institution of slavery provided labor and convenience, while also reinforcing the social hierarchy that defined the empire's organization. Social mobility was limited, but not impossible. Families could improve their status through trade, military service, or political connections, though such advancement often required patience, skill, and favorable circumstances. Education, especially for boys from wealthier families, was a pathway to civic and military careers, while girls' education remained more domestic, though not entirely restricted from cultural or intellectual influence. The lives of ordinary citizens, shaped by work, family, and community, were intertwined with these opportunities and constraints, creating a subtle hierarchy that influenced daily experience and long-term prospects. Religion and ritual played a vital role in uniting citizens across social divisions. Temples, shrines, and altars were visible in nearly every city and village, serving as centers for both spiritual devotion and communal interaction. Festivals and public ceremonies, whether in honor of traditional gods or local deities, brought people together, reinforcing shared identity and cultural continuity. Participation in religious life was both a duty and a source of comfort, offering order and meaning amid economic strain, political instability, and the unpredictability of natural forces. Religious observance acted as a social glue, connecting citizens of different classes while providing moments of reflection and reassurance in daily life. Entertainment, too, offered relief from social pressures. Amphitheaters and theaters hosted games, performances, and gladiatorial contests that drew citizens from across the social spectrum. These events, often funded by wealthy patrons or the state, allowed people to experience communal excitement, to witness acts of skill and bravery, and to temporarily set aside the challenges of daily life. The spectacle of entertainment, combined with religious rituals and civic participation, reinforced social cohesion even as underlying inequalities persisted. Citizens found ways to navigate a society where wealth, privilege, and opportunity were unevenly distributed, creating rhythms of life that balance challenge with tradition, work with leisure. Family and community were central to social stability. Extended families often lived in close proximity, sharing resources, labor, and knowledge. Local communities supported each other through festivals, cooperative work, and mutual aid, creating networks that sustained daily life and mitigated hardship. In urban neighborhoods, neighbors shared courtyards, water sources, and ovens, fostering interaction and reliance within crowded living conditions. In rural villages, communal labor and collective defense reinforced bonds, while families preserved traditions, stories, and practical skills essential to survival. These networks became increasingly important as economic and political pressures grew, offering resilience amid uncertainty. Political awareness, though more visible among elites, extended subtly into everyday life. ordinary citizens observed the consequences of leadership decisions, whether through taxation, local governance, or military mobilization. Rumors of imperial intrigue, succession crises, and frontier conflicts filtered through communities, shaping perceptions of security and opportunity. Civic participation, whether in minor roles within local assemblies or through attendance at public ceremonies, allowed citizens to maintain a sense of engagement with the broader social and political world, even as major decisions were made far from their homes. Economic life for ordinary citizens was a delicate balance. Small tradespeople, artisans, and laborers depended on both personal skill and the stability of the market. Merchants, shopkeepers, and craftsmen navigated fluctuating demand, currency devaluation, and social hierarchy to sustain livelihoods. Families relied on daily earnings, barter, or local exchange systems, adjusting consumption and work to meet both immediate needs and long-term survival. While the wealthy could absorb fluctuations, ordinary citizens demonstrated ingenuity and adaptability, ensuring that markets remained active, communities remained vibrant, and daily life continued with careful attention to resources and opportunity. Education and cultural engagement offered both opportunity and continuity. Schools for boys, often attached to households or guilds, taught reading, writing, arithmetic, rhetoric, and history. Knowledge of law, governance, and civic responsibility provided pathways to military or administrative careers. In some regions, girls participated in education alongside domestic instruction, gaining literacy and skills that enabled cultural engagement and social influence. Libraries, public lectures, and philosophical debates provided further enrichment for those who could access them. Even in times of political uncertainty or economic strain, learning and culture endured as pillars of Roman society, offering structure, reflection, and long-term aspiration. The interplay between social divisions and daily life was evident in the neighborhoods, streets, and villages of the empire. Wealthy estates with lush gardens and frescoed halls contrasted with dense urban apartments, yet both were connected through economic networks, labor systems, and cultural exchange. Slaves and freedmen, artisans and merchants, soldiers and farmers, all interacted within a society bound by law, tradition, and custom. The complex interdependence of these groups reflected both the strengths and vulnerabilities of the empire, revealing how social cohesion persisted even amid inequality and subtle tension. Healthcare and medical knowledge were limited but present. Physicians and healers practiced in cities and towns, offering remedies for common ailments, injuries, and occasional epidemics. In rural areas, knowledge of herbs, traditional practices, and practical care guided families through illness and injury. Disease, malnutrition, and injury remained significant challenges, shaping life expectancy and social dynamics. Communities adapted by sharing knowledge, caring for the vulnerable, and maintaining rituals of health and protection, reinforcing bonds and resilience. Social divisions also shaped religious and civic participation. Wealthy patrons often sponsored festivals, public works, and temples, reinforcing both status and communal responsibility. Ordinary citizens attended and contributed to these events as participants and observers, creating shared cultural experiences that bridged social gaps. Slaves and freedmen sometimes played roles in religious ceremonies, integrating diverse populations into the empire's spiritual life. In this way, religious, civic, and social activity created a sense of belonging and continuity that transcended wealth and privilege, even as disparities remained visible. Through all these aspects of life, ordinary citizens demonstrated resilience, adaptation, and quiet perseverance. Their experiences, while often constrained by economic and social limitations, contributed to the endurance of Roman culture, the stability of communities, and the preservation of daily life. Cities and villages remained centers of productivity, tradition, and cultural expression. Markets continued to hum with activity, neighborhoods maintained rhythms of daily living, and families nurtured the next generation, ensuring that the human fabric of the empire remained intact even under mounting pressures. The social divisions of the empire were a subtle but persistent force shaping history. They influenced economic behavior, cultural engagement, political awareness, and communal life. Ordinary citizens, navigating these divisions with care and ingenuity, preserved continuity while adapting to change. Their lives offer insight into the daily experience of an empire whose grandeur, stability, and eventual transformation depended not only on emperors, armies, and wealth, but on the enduring efforts of those who carried out the rhythms of life across a vast and complex civilization. In imagining the Roman Empire through the eyes of its ordinary citizens, one can picture bustling markets, crowded apartment buildings, peaceful rural villages, vibrant festivals, and quiet family moments. One can hear the hum of conversation, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, and the soft calls of street vendors. The empire's magnificence is evident not only in monumental architecture or military achievement, but in the persistent vitality of everyday life. Even amid social inequality, political instability, and economic strain, the human spirit endured, sustaining Rome's cultural and civic legacy. The Roman Empire, vast and diverse, relied heavily on its legions to maintain stability, defend borders, and enforce imperial authority. Soldiers were the backbone of Rome's power, stationed in forts along rivers, mountains, and deserts, far from the comforts of home. Life in the legions was structured, disciplined, and often harsh. Recruits trained rigorously in combat skills, marching techniques, and strategic maneuvers, preparing for both defense and the occasional campaign of expansion. The legions were a symbol of Rome's strength, yet by the later centuries, the pressures on these soldiers were mounting in subtle but persistent ways. Frontiers demanded constant vigilance. Along the Rhine and Danube rivers, legions watched the movements of Germanic tribes whose patterns of migration, trade, and occasional raids required careful attention. Soldiers built and maintained fortifications, patrolled riverbanks, and monitored passes through dense forests and rugged terrain. In the east, legions faced the disciplined armies of the Persian Empire, trained in cavalry warfare and siegecraft. Across the deserts of North Africa and the Mediterranean coast, troops defended trade routes, coastal settlements, and strategic points, ensuring that commerce, communication, and imperial authority remained intact. The challenges were both human and environmental, requiring adaptation to terrain, climate, and cultural diversity. The recruitment and composition of the legions also evolved over time. Originally filled with Roman citizens, legions increasingly incorporated foreign recruits, mercenaries, and auxiliary troops. These soldiers brought valuable skills and local knowledge, but also introduced complexity in loyalty and integration. Maintaining cohesion required careful leadership, incentives, and attention to morale. Commanders had to ensure that diverse groups worked together effectively, balancing the discipline of the legions with the realities of a multinational force. Loyalty was not always automatic. It was earned, negotiated, and reinforced through pay, provisions, and opportunity for advancement. Logistical challenges placed further strain on the military. Supplying troops across vast distances was a constant concern. Roads, rivers, and supply depots allowed movement of food, weapons, and equipment, yet disruptions due to weather, disease, or conflict could imperil entire campaigns. Soldiers relied on a combination of imperial organization, local support, and their own ingenuity to sustain long-term deployments. Armies on the frontiers were living reminders that the empire's strength depended not only on the presence of soldiers, but on the delicate balance of supply, morale, and effective command. Service in the legions was demanding in both physical and emotional terms. Soldiers endured long marches, harsh weather, and the threat of combat. Camps and forts were functional but often austere, with living quarters, training grounds, and defensive structures designed for utility rather than comfort. Families remained behind in distant towns or villages, and communication was slow, often limited to letters or messengers traveling weeks or months across the empire. Despite these challenges, soldiers developed a strong sense of camaraderie and identity, a shared commitment to duty and honor that transcended personal hardship. The military was closely tied to political stability. Generals who commanded loyal legions could influence succession, elevate emperors, or even claim power themselves. This intersection of military and political authority created both opportunity and risk. Emperors depended on the support of their armies to enforce decrees and maintain control, while soldiers evaluated leadership based on competence, compensation, and prospects for reward. The loyalty of the legions became both a stabilizing and destabilizing force, shaping the empire's trajectory in ways that were both visible and subtle. Military service was also a pathway for social mobility. Ordinary citizens could enlist, earn pay, gain land grants, and in some cases, achieve wealth or influence through successful service. Veterans, returning to civilian life, brought experience, connections, and sometimes land to cultivate. Their presence reinforced the empire's cohesion while also providing a mechanism for integrating diverse populations into Roman society. Yet the challenges of service, risk of death, injury, or long separation from home tempered these opportunities, creating a mix of aspiration, duty, and caution among recruits. The empire's reliance on soldiers was intertwined with broader economic pressures. Maintaining legions required significant resources: food, weapons, armor, and pay. Debasement of currency, inflation, and rising costs increased the strain on provincial economies, creating subtle feedback loops between military and civilian life. Soldiers needed reliable supply lines, and local communities often provided labor, food, or trade to support deployments. The interconnectedness of military and economic systems underscored the empire's complexity and vulnerability, illustrating how pressures on one domain could ripple across the entire system. Combat and defense also evolved during this period. Roman tactics, once focused on disciplined formations and engineering ingenuity, adapted to changing threats. Cavalry units, archers, and auxiliary troops provided flexibility in response to mobile tribal forces, desert warfare, and fortified enemy positions. Siege techniques, fortification construction, and logistics planning became increasingly sophisticated, reflecting the empire's capacity for adaptation even under mounting pressure. Soldiers had to remain versatile, capable of responding to diverse environments and unpredictable adversaries. Life in the legions also included periods of routine and reflection. Soldiers trained daily, maintained equipment, and participated in ceremonial duties. Religious observances, rituals of loyalty, and community life within the camp provided structure and continuity. Soldiers formed networks of friendship, mentorship, and shared identity, reinforcing cohesion in both mundane and extraordinary circumstances. Despite the hardships, the legions preserved discipline, morale, and a sense of purpose, reflecting the enduring cultural and institutional strength of Rome. Disease and mortality were ever-present concerns. Camps, often crowded and located in varied climates, were vulnerable to illness, malnutrition, and injury. Medical knowledge, while limited, provided care through physicians, herbal remedies, and practical treatment. Soldiers learned to navigate these risks, relying on both community knowledge and imperial support to sustain life and readiness. The presence of illness and injury added a layer of uncertainty, reminding soldiers and commanders alike of the fragility of human life, even within a disciplined military system. Interactions with local populations were another defining feature of military service. Soldiers often traded with townspeople, participated in local ceremonies, and engaged with communities near fortifications. These interactions reinforced cultural exchange, economic activity, and mutual dependence. Soldiers were representatives of imperial authority, yet they also became integrated into the social and economic fabric of the regions in which they were stationed. The presence of legions extended Roman influence far beyond the capital, creating a living connection between distant communities and the broader empire. Despite these pressures, the legions remained a symbol of Rome's enduring power. Their discipline, training, and strategic capacity reflected centuries of military tradition, engineering skill, and organizational expertise. Soldiers carried both the authority of the empire and the responsibility to preserve it, acting as both protectors and agents of Roman civilization. Their service, often demanding and perilous, was essential to sustaining the empire's coherence across vast territories. The cumulative strain on the legions, however, was a quiet yet persistent force shaping the empire's trajectory. Long-term deployments, rising economic demands, and the reliance on foreign recruits created both resilience and vulnerability. Soldiers adapted, learned, and endured, yet the empire's capacity to rely on these forces indefinitely would be tested in the centuries to come. The pressures on military life mirrored the broader challenges faced by the empire, balancing strength with sustainability, authority with practical realities, and ambition with human limitations. In imagining the legions at work, one can picture fortified camps along rivers and mountains, soldiers drilling under the sun, watchtowers staffed at dawn, and roads alive with patrols and supply convoys. One can hear the steady rhythm of marching feet, the clang of weapons in training, and the quiet murmurs of camaraderie during evening rest. The legions were not only instruments of power, but communities in themselves, sustaining life, culture, and security in distant reaches of the empire. The military challenges and pressures of service were both a testament to Roman ingenuity and a reminder of the delicate balance required to maintain a vast empire. Soldiers, while resilient and disciplined, reflected the empire's broader vulnerabilities. Their lives were shaped by geography, politics, economics, and human ambition, and their service illuminated the interconnections between frontiers, cities, and the imperial center. In this way, the legions were both the strength and the barometer of Rome's capacity to endure. Even amidst tension, uncertainty, and external threats, the legions preserved the empire's continuity. They bridged distances, enforced law, and symbolized the enduring presence of Roman authority. Yet the strain on soldiers, combined with economic pressures and political instability, contributed quietly to the slow transformation of the empire. The legions remained formidable, disciplined, and resilient, yet their experience reflected the larger story of an empire negotiating the pressures of size, diversity, and the passage of time. The Roman Empire, already vast and complex, experienced profound changes in belief and culture during its later centuries. For centuries, Roman religion had been intertwined with civic life, a blend of traditional gods, local deities, and rituals that reinforced social cohesion and imperial authority. Temples dotted every city, town, and village, where citizens and officials alike observed rites, offered sacrifices, and sought divine favor. Festivals and public ceremonies marked the rhythm of the year, integrating religion into daily existence and offering communal experiences that strengthened civic identity. The presence of gods, whether Jupiter, Mars, or local spirits, was a constant backdrop to life, imbuing both mundane and extraordinary events with sacred significance. Yet by the 3rd century, the empire was encountering new ideas and religious movements that challenged traditional practice. Mystery cults, philosophical schools, and foreign deities introduced spiritual diversity into Roman life. These cults often emphasized personal salvation, moral transformation, or mystical experiences, attracting followers seeking meaning beyond civic ritual. The appeal of these alternative religious experiences reflected broader cultural shifts, as citizens, urban and rural alike, responded to uncertainty, social tension, and the pressures of everyday life. While public worship of state gods persisted, the quiet rise of new faiths foreshadowed significant transformations that would reshape the spiritual landscape of the empire. Christianity, in particular, grew from a small, obscure sect to a movement with widespread appeal. Its message of hope, moral discipline, and community attracted followers from diverse social backgrounds, including slaves, women, and the urban poor. The Christian emphasis on care for the vulnerable, ethical living, and spiritual equality resonated with those who experienced economic strain, social marginalization, or uncertainty in a rapidly changing world. Communities of believers formed in urban neighborhoods, often meeting in private homes or hidden spaces to worship, share resources, and reinforce bonds of solidarity. The persistence and resilience of these communities reflected both personal faith and the broader social context in which they thrived. Religious transformation was not solely a matter of belief, but also of political significance. Emperors and provincial leaders observed the shifting landscape with concern, sometimes responding with tolerance, at other times with persecution. Christians faced periods of both repression and relative acceptance, depending on the temperament of rulers and the broader political climate. The state's relationship with emerging faiths reflected a delicate balance, enforcing traditional authority while negotiating the social reality of evolving belief systems. The rise of Christianity illustrated the empire's dynamic character, capable of both preservation and adaptation in the face of cultural change. The transformation of religious life extended beyond Christianity. Eastern cults, including those dedicated to Isis, Mithras, and other deities, offered rituals and teachings that provided emotional comfort, social connection, and guidance. These faiths often coexisted with Roman civic religion, creating a layered spiritual environment where citizens navigated multiple influences. Festivals, processions, and temple offerings continued alongside emerging practices, illustrating the empire's capacity for integration even amid change. Cultural identity was increasingly multifaceted, reflecting both continuity and innovation in beliefs, practices, and social norms. These religious shifts intersected with art, literature, and public expression. Temples and shrines adapted to new styles, incorporating architectural motifs, iconography, and imagery influenced by diverse regions of the empire. Literature reflected moral, philosophical, and spiritual concerns, offering guidance, reflection, and narrative frameworks for understanding the human condition. Music, performance, and public ceremonies continued to engage citizens, blending traditional practices with evolving cultural expressions. In this way, religious transformation was inseparable from the broader currents of cultural change, influencing how Romans perceived themselves, their communities, and their place in the world. Transformation of belief also influenced social cohesion. Communities built around faith, philosophy, or local custom created networks of support, communication, and moral guidance. For women, slaves, and marginalized citizens, participation in religious or philosophical communities provided status, agency, and a sense of belonging. Citizens found stability in shared rituals and moral frameworks, even as political instability, economic strain, and military pressures persisted. The interplay between traditional civic religion and emerging faiths reinforced both continuity and adaptation, illustrating how culture evolved alongside governance and society. Religious transformation also affected education and intellectual life. Schools, libraries, and philosophical circles debated ethical principles, cosmology, and spiritual questions. Students learned not only literacy and rhetoric, but also moral reasoning and cultural awareness, preparing them for civic participation and engagement with diverse beliefs. Intellectual inquiry intersected with spiritual exploration, reflecting the interwoven nature of knowledge, faith, and daily life. Philosophers and theologians engaged with questions of justice, virtue, and human purpose, providing citizens with guidance amid uncertainty and change. Artistic expression mirrored these religious and cultural shifts. Sculptures, mosaics, and frescoes depicted traditional deities alongside newer figures, blending styles and symbolism. Temples incorporated architectural innovations from across the empire, reflecting regional diversity and practical adaptation. Citizens encountering these expressions in public spaces absorbed both aesthetic and moral messages, reinforcing collective identity while exposing individuals to new ideas. The empire's visual culture became a mirror of its spiritual and social evolution, capturing the interplay of tradition, innovation, and lived experience. Economic life intersected subtly with religious and cultural transformation. Temples and religious institutions often controlled wealth, land, and labor, influencing markets, trade, and local economies. Festivals, sacrifices, and charitable practices created flow of resources, while religious networks facilitated communication and cooperation across regions. The integration of faith with daily life provided structure, moral guidance, and economic activity, reinforcing the empire's complex interdependencies. Citizens engaged with these systems both practically and spiritually, shaping patterns of production, exchange, and social support. The rise of Christianity also foreshadowed shifts in imperial policy and governance. Emperors increasingly recognized the growing influence of Christian communities, navigating their integration into civic structures. Legal codes, taxation, and administrative practices gradually reflected accommodation of new faiths, altering the relationship between state and society. The eventual elevation of Christianity to a privileged position marked a profound transformation, yet its roots lay in centuries of gradual growth, adaptation, and quiet persistence within the social fabric. Cultural shifts extended to daily life, customs, and interpersonal relations. Citizens navigated evolving expectations regarding morality, ethics, and communal responsibility. New ideas about charity, justice, and social obligation influenced behavior in neighborhoods, marketplaces, and households. Families and communities absorbed these influences alongside traditional practices, blending continuity with innovation. The Roman world was not static. It was a living tapestry of beliefs, habits, and cultural practices, continually reshaped by internal reflection and external contact. Even as these transformations unfolded, the rhythms of daily life continued. Markets buzzed with trade, streets echoed with conversation, and neighborhoods maintained routines of work, leisure, and domestic care. Citizens observed festivals, participated in rituals, and nurtured children, weaving continuity into the fabric of change. Religion and culture were inseparable from survival, identity, and social cohesion, offering both guidance and solace amid broader pressures of politics, economy, and military challenges. The transformations of belief also intersected with gender and social roles. Women, often influential within households and local communities, found new opportunities for participation and leadership through religious institutions. Slaves and freedmen engaged in ritual practice, gaining agency, status, and social connection. Youths learned both traditional civic values and emerging ethical frameworks, preparing for roles in the evolving society. Across all levels of social hierarchy, religion and culture mediated interaction, expectation, and moral responsibility. Roman Empire, during this period, exemplified the delicate balance between continuity and change. Traditional civic religion persisted, providing structure, ritual, and legitimacy. Emerging faiths, philosophical movements, and cultural innovations introduced new modes of meaning, expression, and community. Citizens navigated these intersecting currents, sustaining daily life, family networks, and local economies while participating in evolving spiritual and cultural landscapes. The transformation was gradual, pervasive, and resilient, shaping the identity of the empire even as political, economic, and military pressures intensified. Imagining the empire in this era, one can picture temples and shrines alongside hidden meeting places for believers, bustling marketplaces near religious festivals, and homes where philosophical and spiritual discussion complemented daily work. Citizens participated in rituals, observed moral guidance, and engaged with both old and new forms of worship. The empire's cultural richness reflected centuries of adaptation, integration, and quiet transformation, preserving cohesion while opening pathways to profound change. Religious and cultural transformations were thus both a source of stability and a signal of evolution. They strengthened communities, offered moral guidance, and reinforced identity, while simultaneously preparing the empire for shifts that would redefine its spiritual and social structures. Amid the pressures of borders, economic strain, political instability, and military demands, the human capacity for belief, ritual, and cultural expression remained resilient, shaping the empire's enduring legacy. The Roman Empire, vast and diverse, depended upon a delicate economic system that spanned continents, connected cities to villages, and integrated trade, agriculture, and taxation. For centuries, wealth flowed from provinces to Rome, supporting monumental architecture, armies, and public life. Yet by the later centuries, the economic system was under pressure, strained by the costs of defense, administration, and the maintenance of an increasingly complex bureaucracy. Coinage was debased, inflation subtly altered the value of daily transactions, and markets adjusted to shifting supply and demand in ways that reflected both local and imperial realities. Agriculture remained the foundation of the empire's economy. The fertile plains of Gaul, Egypt, and the Nile Valley produced grain, olive oil, wine, and other staples. Farmers worked long hours, dependent on weather, soil fertility, and access to local markets. Smallholders struggled to maintain their plots amidst rising taxes, occasional military requisitions, and fluctuations in harvest yields. Wealthy landowners, often residing in villas far from their estates, relied on overseers and tenants to manage production. The disparity between large estates and small farms highlighted economic inequalities, yet the system allowed both subsistence and surplus, sustaining urban centers and military supply lines across the empire. Urban economies were similarly complex. Markets thrived in cities like Rome, Carthage, Antioch, and Constantinople, supplying goods from across the empire. Merchants dealt in textiles from the east, metals from Iberia, and spices from distant lands. Streets echoed with the clatter of carts, the calls of vendors, and the rhythm of daily commerce. Artisans worked in workshops producing pottery, metalwork, and luxury goods. Citizens navigated these urban economies with care, balancing daily expenditures, participation in festivals, and obligations to both local authorities and the broader imperial system. Economic life required attention, adaptability, and resilience, reflecting the empire's interconnected nature. Trade networks extended beyond the Mediterranean. Caravans traversed deserts, rivers, and mountains, bringing goods from distant regions. Shipping, with ports lined by warehouses and docks, facilitated the movement of grain, textiles, and luxury items. The logistical challenges of this trade were immense. Storms, piracy, and bureaucratic delays threatened delivery, requiring coordination between merchants, local authorities, and military escorts. The flow of goods was more than an economic activity. It was a lifeline connecting provinces, sustaining urban populations, and reinforcing Rome's authority over distant lands. Taxation, a key instrument of economic management, placed a quiet but constant burden on citizens. Land tax, trade tariffs, and special levies funded armies, infrastructure, and administration. While necessary for imperial function, the cumulative impact of taxation weighed on both rural and urban populations. Farmers, merchants, and artisans adjusted production, trade, and household management to meet obligations, often developing informal networks of barter, lending, and cooperative effort to navigate fluctuations. These measures reflected both ingenuity and necessity, illustrating the delicate balance of sustaining empire-wide systems while supporting individual livelihoods. Inflation and currency debasement became increasingly visible over time. Coins, once a reliable measure of value, were gradually reduced in precious metal content. Prices adjusted, wages were recalculated, and citizens became aware of the subtle erosion of purchasing power. Urban dwellers, dependent on markets for grain, fuel, and clothing, felt the cumulative effects in their daily lives. Rural communities, while less directly affected by coinage, encountered challenges in trade and taxation, as local goods and labor became increasingly entangled with the broader imperial economy. The quiet adjustments citizens made reflected resilience and adaptation under conditions of uncertainty. Military expenditures added further pressure to the economic system. Maintaining legions along distant frontiers, supplying food, weapons, armor, and pay required immense resources. Campaigns, fort construction, and frontier administration consumed wealth generated across the provinces. Soldiers' wages influenced local economies, supporting merchants and artisans near forts. Yet the cost of sustaining military readiness contributed to strain, particularly when combined with political instability, natural disasters, and fluctuations in agricultural output. The empire's economic resilience depended on careful coordination, adaptability, and the ability to absorb shocks without systemic collapse. Local economies were often self-sufficient in daily practice, even as imperial policies influenced broader patterns. Villages maintained granaries, workshops, and communal systems for labor and production. Markets in smaller towns facilitated trade in essential goods, while festivals and religious events generated periodic economic activity. Local artisans, farmers, and merchants navigated these rhythms, adjusting production and trade to meet both communal and imperial demands. These adaptive practices reflected the resourcefulness of citizens, sustaining life and continuity even under external pressures. Economic pressures also influenced social dynamics. Wealth disparities, taxation, and military requisition shaped perceptions of fairness, opportunity, and authority. Large estates relied on labor from slaves, tenants, and smallholders, while urban elites accumulated wealth through trade, property, and civic engagement. Ordinary citizens adapted, negotiating work, trade, and social networks to maintain stability. Social cohesion, in part, depended on citizens' ability to manage economic realities, balancing personal need with collective responsibility. The flow of wealth, while uneven, sustained both the empire's grandeur and the everyday rhythms of life. The interplay of economy and culture was subtle yet profound. Public works, temples, and entertainment relied on resources generated through taxation and trade. Festivals, games, and civic projects created opportunities for social cohesion, cultural continuity, and communal engagement. Citizens' participation, whether through monetary contribution, labor, or attendance, reinforced identity, belonging, and cultural memory. Economic systems thus intertwined with social and spiritual life, illustrating the interdependence of material and cultural realities in sustaining empire-wide cohesion. Debt and credit were common in urban centers. Merchants, artisans, and households relied on loans, barter agreements, and informal credit networks to maintain activity and meet obligations. Markets operated with a mix of coinage and exchange, reflecting practical adaptation to fluctuating resources. Families often pooled labor, resources, and expertise to manage seasonal demands and emergencies. These adaptive practices highlighted the resilience of ordinary citizens, who preserved continuity in daily life while navigating the subtle pressures of economic uncertainty. The empire's integration of regional economies created both strength and vulnerability. Wealth, goods, and labor moved across provinces, supporting centralized authority and reinforcing cultural cohesion. At the same time, disruptions in one region, crop failure, invasion, or political instability could ripple through trade, supply, and taxation systems. Governors, administrators, and military commanders had to respond to these interdependencies, balancing immediate needs with long-term sustainability. The interconnectedness of the empire reflected its ingenuity, yet it also revealed the fragility of vast and complex systems. Agricultural productivity was increasingly variable. Soil depletion, changing climate patterns, and the pressures of taxation challenged farmers' ability to maintain consistent output. Irrigation systems, granaries, and storage techniques helped mitigate risks, yet the reliance on human labor, animal power, and local knowledge remained critical. Rural life demanded adaptation, skill, and persistence. Communities developed cooperative labor practices, shared resources, and informal support networks, illustrating the resilience of ordinary citizens in sustaining the empire's foundation. The pressures on trade, taxation, and military expenditure influenced imperial decision-making. Emperors and governors were acutely aware that economic strain could affect loyalty, stability, and social cohesion. Policies sought to balance revenue with public welfare, military support with civilian need, and local autonomy with imperial oversight. The subtle tension between extraction and support shaped both macroeconomic structures and everyday life, reflecting the empire's capacity for adaptation while revealing vulnerabilities that would intensify over time. Markets and trade hubs were alive with activity, yet they also mirrored the empire's complexity and subtle fragility. Merchants navigated changing prices, demand, and political oversight. Consumers adjusted consumption, substituted goods, or relied on local networks to secure essential items. Artisans and craftsmen maintained production, innovated techniques, and responded to shifting preferences. Even amidst uncertainty, economic life continued, reflecting continuity, adaptation, and the quiet resilience of citizens who ensured that both material needs and cultural practices were sustained. In imagining the empire's economic landscape, one can picture bustling harbors, market stalls crowded with goods from across continents, workshops filled with artisans shaping metals and clay, and fields stretching across provinces, dotted with laborers tending crops and animals. Roads connected cities and towns, facilitating trade and communication. The movement of wealth, goods, and labor reflected the empire's integration, ingenuity, and interdependence. It was a system both magnificent and delicate, sustaining the grandeur of Rome while relying on countless citizens to maintain its rhythms. Economic strain was thus both a challenge and a reflection of the empire's complexity. It shaped social behavior, influenced political decisions, and interacted with military and cultural pressures. Citizens adapted, negotiated, and persevered, maintaining continuity in daily life while responding to systemic forces that could alter circumstances suddenly or gradually. The flow of wealth, production, and labor was the lifeblood of the empire, sustaining its cities, armies, and cultural achievements while quietly highlighting the limitations of a system under mounting pressure. The Roman Empire's economic story was one of interconnection, adaptation, and subtle transformation. Trade, taxation, and agriculture supported not only material life, but social cohesion, cultural identity, and political authority. Citizens, whether merchants, farmers, soldiers, or artisans, participated in these systems daily, sustaining continuity while navigating uncertainty. The empire's enduring grandeur depended on this delicate balance, a network of effort, ingenuity, and resilience that linked the material and cultural foundations of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. The Roman Empire, in its vastness and complexity, relied upon a delicate balance of political authority to maintain cohesion. Emperors, senators, governors, and local magistrates all played roles in governance, yet the concentration of power at the imperial center often created both opportunity and vulnerability. By the 3rd century, political instability became increasingly visible. Emperors rose and fell with startling frequency, sometimes due to military support, sometimes as a result of court intrigue, and occasionally from sheer misfortune. The perception of imperial authority, critical to the functioning of the empire, became intertwined with the loyalty of the legions, the approval of elites, and the tacit acceptance of ordinary citizens. The crisis of succession, frequent during this period, disrupted the continuity of governance. Emperors sometimes left no clear heir, leaving power to be contested by generals, senators, or ambitious officials. Legions stationed on the frontiers held the balance of power, with loyalty often shifting in response to promises of pay, land, or political favor. Cities and provinces watched these changes with cautious awareness, aware that the rise or fall of an emperor could ripple across borders, influence taxation, and even affect local security. The unpredictability of imperial leadership introduced subtle tension into daily life, affecting both elites and ordinary citizens. The centralization of authority also created dependence on individual competence. The abilities of an emperor, military strategy, economic insight, and administrative skill shaped the fortunes of the empire. Weak leadership could result in delayed responses to invasions, inefficient taxation, or mismanagement of resources. Strong leaders, in contrast, could stabilize provinces, secure borders, and restore confidence in governance. Citizens, soldiers, and local administrators alike recognized the influence of leadership on their lives, creating a culture attuned to both the visible and unseen consequences of political power. Political instability was mirrored by the rise of regional power centers. Governors and military commanders, often located far from Rome, exercised significant autonomy. Their decisions could stabilize or disrupt local life, affecting taxation, trade, and security. The delegation of authority allowed flexibility and responsiveness, yet it also introduced risks of misalignment with central policies or ambitions for personal power. The relationship between the emperor and regional authorities was thus a constant negotiation, balancing oversight, local knowledge, and the potential for opportunistic action. Civil wars, rebellion, and usurpation became recurring themes. The empire occasionally fractured temporarily as competing claimants sought recognition, armies clashed, and political alliances shifted. These conflicts, while often brief in duration, left lasting effects on communities, economies, and military structures. Towns near conflict zones experienced disruption of markets, destruction of property, and shifts in administration. Citizens navigated these challenges with caution, adapting routines, storing resources, and relying on local networks to maintain stability during periods of uncertainty. The intricate system of law and administration played a role in maintaining continuity amidst instability. Roman legal principles, codified in statutes and traditions, provided frameworks for dispute resolution, property rights, and governance. Governors and magistrates applied these laws with varying degrees of consistency, yet the underlying structure offered a sense of order even when emperors changed rapidly. Citizens, soldiers, and officials relied on legal stability as a counterbalance to the unpredictability of political leadership, preserving social cohesion and civic life in challenging times. Military influence on politics was both stabilizing and destabilizing. Legions, essential for defending borders, could also determine succession, endorse usurpers, or challenge emperors. Soldiers' loyalty was influenced by pay, opportunity, and the charisma of leaders, creating a dynamic where political power was inseparable from military support. Emperors understood that authority depended not only on laws and traditions, but on active engagement with the legions, reinforcing a cycle in which political and military spheres were intertwined. Corruption, favoritism, and intrigue subtly influenced governance. Officials sometimes prioritized personal gain or regional loyalty over imperial directives. Patronage networks, gifts, and strategic marriages shaped administration, creating both cohesion and tension within bureaucratic structures. Citizens observed, navigated, and occasionally participated in these systems, finding ways to maintain security, commerce, and social life despite unpredictable enforcement of laws and policies. The quiet complexity of administration reflected the empire's adaptability while also revealing vulnerabilities inherent in human ambition and institutional dependence. Emperors' policies regarding taxation, trade, and military mobilization affected daily life across the empire. Farmers, artisans, and merchants adjusted production and labor to meet obligations. Soldiers responded to pay, deployment orders, and campaign schedules. Governors balanced imperial directives with local conditions, often negotiating compromises that preserved both authority and stability. The consequences of political decisions were felt far from the capital, reminding citizens that governance was not abstract but embedded in the rhythms of daily existence. Religious and cultural policy intersected with political authority. Emperors influenced public observance, temple construction, and the integration of emerging faiths. Decisions regarding tolerance or suppression of new movements, such as Christianity, shaped social cohesion, loyalty, and the moral framework of communities. Citizens navigated these policies, sometimes adapting practices, sometimes maintaining traditional observances, illustrating the interplay between governance, culture, and spiritual life in sustaining the empire. Economic management was also inseparable from political stability. Currency debasement, taxation rates, and resource allocation were influenced by leadership decisions. Provinces experienced variation in enforcement, collection efficiency, and access to markets. Merchants, artisans, and farmers responded to these conditions with adaptation, ingenuity, and local negotiation. Economic fluctuations reflected both natural forces and political choice, reminding citizens that the empire's prosperity depended on the skill and foresight of those in power. Emperors also faced external pressures from neighboring powers. Persian forces, Germanic tribes, and other groups tested military capacity and strategic planning. political decision-making intertwined with military campaigns, influencing resource distribution, border defense, and citizen confidence. The interdependence of governance, military readiness, and social cohesion highlighted the empire's complexity, requiring constant attention, foresight, and coordination to maintain stability across vast territories. Despite the frequent turnover of emperors, the institutions of the empire provided continuity. The Senate, magistrates, local councils, and administrative networks preserved legal, economic, and cultural structures. These frameworks allowed daily life to proceed, even amidst uncertainty at the top. Citizens continued to farm, trade, worship, and educate their children, demonstrating resilience and adaptability in navigating political turbulence. The rhythm of ordinary life maintained stability while political power shifted, creating a contrast between visible authority and enduring social structures. The perception of legitimacy played a critical role. Emperors sought recognition not only from the Senate and military, but from citizens themselves. Public works, games, festivals, and civic engagement reinforced authority and moral standing. Recognition, whether through ceremony, tax relief, or infrastructure investment, strengthened the bond between ruler and populace. Citizens, in turn, evaluated emperors based on effectiveness, fairness, and personal conduct, participating indirectly in the dynamics of political legitimacy. The accumulation of power and the potential for overreach created tension within the system. Ambitious generals, governors, or court officials sometimes exploited weaknesses, challenging central authority or seeking personal gain. The interplay of ambition, loyalty, and institutional structures shaped the trajectory of the empire, influencing not only political stability but military effectiveness, economic management, and social cohesion. Citizens, while largely distant from high politics, experienced the consequences in subtle and tangible ways, adapting routines, safeguarding property, and negotiating obligations. In imagining political life, one can picture imperial courts, senate chambers, and provincial offices where decisions affecting millions were made. Soldiers carried orders across borders, merchants adapted to changing taxation, and families navigated both opportunity and constraint. News traveled slowly yet carried profound implications, connecting distant citizens to the rhythms of governance and the personalities of rulers. The empire's stability depended on a network of interdependent systems, human decision-making, and adaptive resilience, reflecting both the grandeur and fragility of Roman political life. Political instability, while disruptive, also demonstrated the empire's flexibility. Institutions adapted, power centers shifted, and ordinary citizens persisted, sustaining economic, cultural, and social life. The legacy of these years revealed the dual nature of authority, both necessary for coordination and vulnerable to human ambition, error, and external pressure. Governance was a living process, shaped by events, individuals, and the quiet perseverance of communities across the empire. The pressures of leadership, succession, and regional authority foreshadowed larger transformations to come. They reflected the delicate balance of central power, local autonomy, and societal expectation. Citizens and soldiers, elites and commoners, all participated in this dynamic system, consciously or unconsciously, preserving life and culture even as the mechanisms of rule evolved. Political instability was not merely chaos. It was a force shaping adaptation, resilience, and the enduring structures of Roman civilization. The Roman Empire's borders, stretching from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania, faced mounting pressure from external forces. Tribes and confederations, often long in contact with Roman culture, began to move with greater frequency and force. Germanic tribes such as the Goths and Vandals pressed along the Danube and Rhine, their migrations driven by population growth, climate shifts, and pressure from other nomadic groups. To the east, the Sassanid Empire posed a disciplined and persistent challenge, testing both Roman strategy and logistical capacity. These invasions, while episodic, placed enormous strain on the empire's military, economic resources, and morale. Legions along the frontiers were tasked with defending vast stretches of land, constructing forts, and patrolling rivers and passes. Soldiers contended with harsh climates, unfamiliar terrain, and the unpredictability of hostile groups. Fortifications, built over centuries, provided temporary security but required constant maintenance and reinforcement. Scouts and intelligence networks monitored enemy movements, while supply lines ensured that troops could be fed, equipped, and rotated. Even so, the sheer scale of the empire made complete security impossible, leaving citizens and soldiers in a state of heightened vigilance. Raids were often unpredictable and localized, yet they revealed vulnerabilities in the empire's defenses. Villages near frontiers could be abandoned, farms destroyed, and trade routes disrupted. Citizens relied on fortifications, local militias, and the rapid mobilization of legions to survive. Economic activity fluctuated in response to these pressures, affecting markets, taxation, and the provision of essential goods. Communities adapted through resource stockpiling, communal labor, and temporary migration, highlighting both resilience and the subtle fragility of the imperial system. In some cases, invaders were integrated into the empire through treaties, military service, or settlement agreements. Foederati, allied tribes settled along borders in exchange for military support, reflected Rome's pragmatic approach. Yet these arrangements were not without risk. Integration required careful negotiation of loyalty, cultural differences, and economic responsibility. The presence of allied tribes could stabilize frontiers, but it also created potential internal tensions that could manifest in rebellion, resource strain, or political conflict. The psychological impact of invasions was significant. Citizens, soldiers, and administrators perceived a constant tension between security and threat. News of raids, battles, or shifts in tribal movements spread slowly yet carried profound implications. Fear, caution, and adaptation became part of everyday life, influencing where people lived, how they farmed, and how communities organized defense. The empire's frontiers were not merely geographic boundaries. They were zones of interaction, negotiation, and persistent challenge that shaped the consciousness of its people. Military strategy evolved in response to these pressures. Roman commanders relied on a combination of fortifications, mobile cavalry units, and intelligence gathering. Roads and supply depots were critical, allowing rapid deployment of reinforcements and provision of remote outposts. Military discipline, combined with experience in varied terrains, allowed legions to respond effectively, even under sustained pressure. Yet the empire's vastness meant that complete control was impossible, and frontier stress gradually revealed the limitations of even the most disciplined forces. Economic strain accompanied these invasions. Defense required resources for fort construction, troop pay, and logistical support. Provinces near borders faced additional demands, both in taxes and labor, to sustain military readiness. Markets and trade were disrupted, yet citizens adapted, shifting production, storage, and local exchange to meet immediate needs. These pressures reflected the interconnected nature of empire, where military, economic, and social factors were inseparable, influencing both local experience and imperial policy. Cultural interaction also occurred at the borders. Invaders, allies, and refugees brought new customs, languages, and practices into Roman territory. Cities, forts, and villages absorbed these influences, gradually altering local culture. Trade, intermarriage, and the integration of military units facilitated exchange, while religion, law, and civic life preserved continuity. The frontier was both a zone of threat and a bridge for cultural adaptation, illustrating the empire's dynamic response to external pressures. In some regions, repeated invasions destabilized long-standing settlements. Farmers abandoned fields, towns were depopulated, and fortresses were rebuilt or relocated. Yet even in these circumstances, communities persisted, relying on local knowledge, labor cooperation, and social networks. Citizens developed adaptive strategies to manage risk, including relocating temporarily, reinforcing fortifications, or negotiating settlements with invaders. The resilience of communities reflected human ingenuity under persistent challenge. The accumulation of frontier pressures over decades contributed to broader transformation. Legions, stretched thin, required reinforcement, pay, and reliable leadership. Provinces faced economic strain from both taxation and disrupted trade. Political authority was tested by the need to respond to external threats while maintaining internal cohesion. Ordinary citizens, soldiers, and elites alike experienced these pressures, shaping daily life, community organization, and perceptions of imperial strength. In imagining the empire under these conditions, one can picture fortified walls along riverbanks, watchtowers staffed at dawn, and distant signals relaying news of approaching threats. Soldiers drill on open fields, while citizens in villages store food, reinforce buildings, and maintain awareness of potential raids. Caravans adjust travel routes, markets fluctuate with scarcity, and fortresses hum with coordinated activity. The empire, resilient yet vulnerable, depended on constant vigilance, adaptation, and the perseverance of its people. Invasions, both small-scale and massive, were not merely military events. They were catalysts for social, economic, and cultural change. Communities absorbed new influences, negotiated survival, and adapted governance and economic practice. The empire's ability to respond to external threats reflected both its strengths and inherent vulnerabilities, demonstrating the interplay of human ingenuity, institutional structure, and environmental pressures in sustaining civilization across vast territories. The story of Rome's borders is one of tension, adaptation, and quiet endurance. While invasions challenged security and authority, they also prompted innovation, integration, and resilience. Soldiers, citizens, and leaders navigated a complex landscape where threat and opportunity coexisted, preserving daily life while shaping the trajectory of the empire. The legacy of these years lies not only in battles or conquests, but in the perseverance of communities across frontiers, sustaining both identity and continuity amid relentless challenge.